Shalom and welcome to this edition of Revealing the Truth, where we cover the headlines, the heart lines, and biblical truth. I'm your host, the Reverend Rabbi Eric Walker, author of the newly released book, The 7 Laws of Abundant Living, Lessons Learned from the Tree of Life. You can visit our website, click on the book, and give us your email address and read the first chapter. I'm very happy this morning to introduce you to Glen and Ellen Schuknecht, author of A Spiritual Heritage, Connecting Kids and Grandkids to God and Family. Glen and Ellen, welcome to the program.
Thank you. We're delighted to be able to be here with you.
Well, we're very happy to have you here. You, for several years, have been the head of student discipleship and discipline at Veritas Academy, where you continue working part-time with parents and students while you consult and speak for Family Wings. Ellen is the head of Family Ministries at Veritas, director of Family Wings, and a national speaker for University Model Schools International. She has contributed to several books on parenting and education, has appeared on Focus on the Family. The Schuknechts live in Manchaca, Texas. What a great resource. What a time of year. And maybe this is the time for families to begin building a spiritual heritage. Now, the question for you is, what is a spiritual heritage, and where did each one of you obtain yours, and who orchestrated that for you? Who was the key influencer? So, Ellen, let me be the polite gentleman and start with you first, and then I will ask Glen the same question.
Wow, that's a loaded question. And first of all, I would like to say that to me, a spiritual heritage is that transfer of faith from one generation to the next, and building a home in which that's cultivated, and that people, that our children really are walking out in a faith with Jesus. And you asked about who were the significant people in my life. I did not grow up in a Christian home when I was young, but I did have a grandfather in Finland. Even though he was across the world from me, he was very influential in my life because I knew he prayed. And every time he would send us a note or he would call us, which was very, very infrequent, he would always talk about how he was praying for us. And for some reason, as a child, that really spoke to me and gave me a sense of security. But I have to say that as I've thought about our own spiritual heritage and passing that on to our children, one of the significant things that came to me was the importance of the history of family, but also the history of God's redemption of man. And Glen and I had the privilege of going to Israel 5 years ago. We were excited to read about you and hear your background. And when we were over there, it just spoke to me how deeply the stories, God's stories, wove through that land, and how much the stories of faith from the Old Testament through the New are just built with these amazing inspirational power in our lives if we really do listen to them. So I guess it's a combination of seeing my own grandfather, knowing he prayed, watching my parents come to faith through his prayers and God calling them, and then just seeing how our story as a family fits in context of God's greater story. And I don't know if that's the answer you were looking for, but...
Well, no, it's really quite fascinating to me that you are describing that the impact of prayer, even remotely, was such a strong connection to want you to carry it on. We most often think of the nuclear family unit, and in today's environment, that's no longer the norm. And many families have become quite hopeless because they are fractured. They are divided by divorce. They are divided by distance. The family has gone in 12 directions. I have one sister that lives in Pittsburgh, one sister that lives in Florida. My mother lives in Pittsburgh. I live in Alabama. But how do you maintain that? And the answer you gave is really the first ray of hope I've had, and the first cohesive practical tool that I've heard that says that even over long distance. Now, today, of course, we use texting, we use Facebook, we use those kind of methods, but the concept of him writing you a letter and letting you know this was the Pauline way of I've been praying for you and established a pattern of prayer. So I find that quite interesting and quite unique because that is a remote influence that impacted you to want to hold on to something that was tangible yet unseen.
And if I may add to that, I distinctly remember being a young child and looking up into the heavens and thinking, my grandfather is out there and his prayers are going up for me. And I also knew his story of struggle, which we do include in the book, and how his ability to find God through struggle and how that really buoyed me. And I think that for our children, we're really blessed. We have the very unique situation of living by our adult children here in Texas, even though we raised them in Oregon, and of doing life with our grandchildren. We know that's not the norm, but no matter where you are or who you are, the ability to pray and inspire hope in the Lord is such a great role for grandparents.
Well, I think that's a absolutely beautiful presentation. Now, Glen.
My history is different. I grew up in a very strong Christian home. My grandfather was a pastor for 50 years. He was president of a Christian seminary in Edmonton, Canada, and pastored many churches. And so I grew up in a home that had tremendous faith constantly. Many times, 3, 4, or 5 times a week, we would be going to church. But you know, sometimes the saying hits me that there are no grandkids in heaven. You have to believe, you have to be a son of God in order to get to heaven. And the fact that my family grew up so strong, it's something I take for granted, maybe something that I allowed just, well, this is part of life and I don't need to work hard at it. And so it's a very different, my life was very different. Ellen says that one of the things that drew her to me, besides all my good looks and everything else, and being bald, she loved that bald look, I think, but was the faith legacy that I had, the faith my family had over the years. And we have been excited, fortunate that God has continued that with our own children. Like Ellen said, we bought 5 acres here in Texas, and 2 of our daughters' families live right here on the 5 acres with us. And so we see 7 of our grandkids multiple times a day, and we feel so fortunate and so blessed with that.
So what heritage did you take? Ellen, do you write letters?
To my grandkids?
Yes.
Yes, actually, I keep journals for them, and I write letters in the journals and have them respond back. They go to a school that they're part at school and part at home, and I do one of the home days with them. And so we write through journals, and I have a record right now of 3 years of letters back and forth with a number of my grandchildren. And that's really a blessing to go back and see that.
Well, that's quite incredible. Now, are you engaging them in the writing back and even in the
Absolutely.
rudimentary? Have you created boxes or memory boxes? I hear so many different things that people want to leave as the heritage, and yours is the spiritual heritage. This is the desire of every family, is to create a family of faith.
Right.
But that is not always the case, and you're also kids and grandkids, there is a special connection.
Mm-hmm.
And the parents of the day-to-day, they're the warden, they're the gatekeeper. The grandparents often have the role of the spoiler, the safe place to run to. But in your book, A Spiritual Heritage, what practical, and these are practical, philosophical bullets or principles that you're trying to establish, that if families can grab a hold of it now, early on in the process, it can become repeatable, it can become scalable, and it will set the pattern that you are not only doing this for your grandchildren, but you are teaching your children how to be the next generation of grandparent.
Mm-hmm. So two things come to mind, and there are two different chapters in the book. But the first one is there's a book on the balance between justice and truth, or truth and love, however we put it in there. And it's the importance of always holding kids to God's standards, yet doing it in loving ways. And I find with our grandkids, it's easy for them to come and us to be the listening ones, but my grandkids know that I love them so much that I'm also going to hold them to a standard and back their parents. And so they know that, and I always tell them it's because I love them and that I really love them so much. I really don't want to let them by with what they're seeing, and always pointing them to the heart. So I think it's important that as parents and grandparents that we are willing to live in that tension between God's truth and grace, that we hold them both together. We don't let go of standards when we don't let go of love, and that we blend them together in our approach to kids. But in the book, one of the chapters, we write about what's called the right strategy. And I would say if there's a practical giveaway tool, it falls into that chapter where it starts with relationship. And it gets easy as parents and as grandparents for us to see our kids and feel like we have to be teaching and telling them what they've done wrong and always correcting them. And yet if that step happens outside of a relationship, we've lost our influence. And so the right strategy is relationship, that we are always mindful of the need to have a heart connection with our kids and grandkids, that we listen, that our approval is not based on their actions. It's just like Jesus loves us unconditionally. We are to love and to be there in their process of growing. And so many times as parents, we want so much for our kids that if they're not doing things just perfectly, we withhold our approval, and yet growth is a process. So the relationship side is being warm. The I part of it right is then inspiring, always connecting what you're telling them and talking to them about vision, about how you see them fitting into God's plan and what his purpose would be for them, and aligning their characteristics with ways that they can be in God's kingdom in service. So that's that inspirational part. But if there is a relationship that's connected and there is inspiration and hope, then the teaching and the equipping we tend to fall to first as parents and grandparents falls on ears that are more reachable. So that is the process. I could give you lots of examples, but I believe those 4 steps are key to how we really influence faith for our kids.
Who does what in this? Excuse me. Glen, are you and Ellen on even par, or do you have defined roles in this? Are you the Bible reader to them? Are you the storyteller to them? Are you the hands of helping them craft ideas? How do you use, in the congregation, we talk about the application of spiritual gifting. How do you use your grandparental gifting those things which you are naturally gifted and talented and naturally connected with your grandchildren, how do you divide that between the two of you?
Mm-hmm. Oh, I think Ellen does a lot of the day-to-day. She's the one that bakes all the fancy cookies and breads and those kind of things, which is definitely not a gift of mine. You know, my role in this, and the thing I love most about it, is going out and encouraging fathers and grandfathers to share the stories of the heritage of the family. Storytelling is just such a critical part, and dads and grandpas have to become great storytellers, and kids love it when we are good storytellers and we tell those stories. I love Deuteronomy 6, and it just says, tell them about their heritage in the morning and in the evening, and
in the coming and going,
in the car when you're driving with them. We a lot of times take our grandkids to school, since we're going anyway, and we'll have 6, 7 of them, 10 of them go to the school that we work at of the 11. So, and they love to hear stories about the family. I get the privilege, because we live so close, of putting my grandkids to bed at night often. And we often will tell, that's a great time to tell a story. I think dinner time's a time of family communion, family talking, family interacting, going through the day. But then that bedtime is a great time to tell those heritage stories, and even talk a little bit about what characteristic that you have did you see in your great grandpa, that kind of thing. And I love that. I also have a blessing that I say over them every night, the same one. And it's just a thing that I do. I put my hand on their head, and my 12-year-old grandson and my 2.5-year-old granddaughter and all of them in between get that blessing. And as dads, we need to treasure that, putting kids to bed at night time. And it interferes. A lot of times there's a game on TV that I want to go watch, and yet each grandkid gets a half hour, and doing that.
Well, I'd like to add, he's talking about what he did with his own children and what we encourage our children to do with their children. But also, I was thinking of a grandmother we spoke to just a few weeks ago, and she started writing email stories to her grandchildren, all of them. She would put together a weekly kind of a email blog to her grandchildren. And then she one week said, you know what, I don't think they're really reading this or it matters, so she didn't do it, and she heard from them. Why didn't you send that to a grandma? Why didn't you send that? And I think that grandpas and grandmas can, from a distance, connect through technology and do a lot of this that way.
And it's amazing. We as grandparents, the kids do want to listen to us and hear. But I'm just loving being able to tell stories. And the stories don't always have to be heritage stories. The stories can be moral, strong stories. They can be Bible stories. They can be all these things that we help our grandkids to become courageous and some of those things.
When you were raising your children, did you raise them to be your children, or were you raising a generation of mothers and fathers, husbands and wives?
I love your question. I feel like in my heart of hearts and in Glen's, we were raising mothers and fathers and husbands and wives. And we're very, our youngest son is our pastor. My daughter, Erin, our oldest daughter, she's the one who really inspires us. She's an author. And then our son is the head of our school. So we have very close ties with them all, but they're very independent and very strong in their own faith. But always for me, I always remember thinking when they were little, I would try to envision what they would be like as parents and what they would be like in their adult life. And there's that kind of that sense of what God places in us, that we're doing something that has lasting generational value.
One of the questions that I often get boys in my office who have made a poor choice, and I ask them, who are you studying for? And their immediate reaction, since we're a Christian school, is God. And I said, well, yeah, that's good. And then their parents. And I said, yeah, but no, you haven't hit it. Well, how about I studied for me? I said, more. And we finally get to the conclusion that they are studying hard for their future wife and for their future kids that they've never met. And they've never thought about that. They never really hadn't hit them. So I encourage that, the future, being a great husband. That's why I do what I do.
That's why on that right strategy that I talked about earlier, the I, when one of my grandkids will do something that is not great, and they all do, of course, I will ask them, is that really who you want to become? Is that who you see yourself being? Casting it forward. And kids can't really make that connection right now, but if we place a belief and we paint the vision for them, eventually they get there. Because they're going to believe in themselves if we do. And it's always saying, and they can answer that question because they don't want to be a liar or someone who's done something unkind, but they get stuck in the moment.
When you gauge the impact that this has happened, this is taking hold, what do you use? What are you looking at to measure? Because you've documented in a book, really it's a methodology. It's a how-to. It's not so much as a what to, it's a how-to. It creates a vision and gives you tools to be able to fulfill that vision. What feedback are you getting? Visible, tangible, not just from your grandchildren, but how is it impacting you're very inter-knit. You school together, work together, live close by together. That can, in a nuclear environment, be nuclear. It could also very much bring a sense of unity that you begin to see as they grow older, they don't drift from it. The older brother is the protector of the younger. The cousins are more connected with each other. They consider their peer group as the nucleus of their peer group is the family first, then friends outside. How do you measure whether or not you are building a good spiritual heritage?
You ask such good questions. One of the things that I see is if we work with a lot of families through the years. I've been working in the area of family ministry through schools for many, many years. So I've had the privilege of seeing a lot of what we talk about in the book work. And for me, it's the outcome is based on kids staying in the faith, staying in relationship with their parents, a family staying strong. And if there's anything at the foundation of what Glen and I want, it's to build strong families. And I want to share a little story here. We raised our kids in Bend, Oregon, and I remember back in the year 2002 going to church and being pretty forlorn because our kids were all in other states. We were not living by them. We felt disconnected. And that evening in church, there was a visiting pastor, and he said he felt like he needed to pray over Glen and I, and we were in the back of the church, and we were going, what? And he said a prayer that I wrote in my journal that I'll never forget. He said he wanted to tell us that God was going to unite our family and we would be a light to others and an encouragement and a hope for families. And I remember at the time thinking, how can we do that? We don't even live together around each other. And it wasn't long that we all wound up living in Austin, Texas. And, to begin with, it wasn't always easy. Different personalities, all of us adults, meshing lives. But what I have seen over the course of the years as we've been here in Texas and ministered to families is that we, just by nature of the fact that our family is close and united, and it brings hope to other families. They think, oh my gosh, I can do it. And we encourage children to repair their hurts with their own parents and to work at restoration There's a chapter in our book about being peacemakers and how to face conflict and work through to resolution. And I think by the fact that we've had to do that, living nearby each other and working together and being so intertwined, that model is hope. And I believe that's why God has really brought us here.
Well,
I think one of the things that I see, our school structure is the moms will homeschool their kids 2 days a week, maybe 3, and the dads have become cheerleaders. Man, you're doing a great job, dear. And the dad is just letting the mom take over. And one of our encouragements is, Dad, you've got to step in those other areas. You've got to step in and still be the spiritual leader. And we're worried. I worry about dads a lot. Our dads are becoming more passive and just allowing the mom, the wife, the grandma to do the work. And
well, let's hold that thought, because we're going to take a break, and I want to explore on that with you, because there's a matriarchal society that has a certain dynamic where it appears to be matriarchal, but the Godfather does exist. And the whole family knows that Grandma runs things, but Papa has the final say, and the power is very clear. So I want to make sure that there is that role not being abdicated, because that does happen even with a strong maternal instinct. We're talking with Glen and Ellen Schuknecht, from authors of A Spiritual Heritage, Connecting Kids and Grandkids to God and Family, brought to us by our good friends over at Kriegel Publications. We're going to take a short break, and when we come back, we're going to continue this discussion just on the other side. Back. Shalom. I'm the Reverend Rabbi Eric Walker, Executive Director of Igniting a Nation and host of the daily TV program Revealing the Truth, seen live every Monday through Friday from 9 a.m. to 1 p.m. Central Standard Time at www.ianbn.com, and then replayed throughout the day and night via our website. All of our segments can be seen on the Igniting a Nation YouTube channel. Since our launch in January of this year, we've expanded our global reach to over 54 countries with a social media following of over 125,000. Our commitment is to bring you the most in-depth interviews with authors, subject matter experts, and thought leaders from around the world. We have interviewed guests from Israel, Brazil, England, India, and all across North America. All of our authors are featured on the Books and Media page on our website, www.ianbn.com. There you can find a direct link to the book you want to order, and we receive a small commission directly from Amazon. There is no cost to you for this service. In addition to our daily teachings and interviews, we make available to you the archive of all of the interviews on our YouTube, Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram channels. Our live program is available from our homepage, and there is never a charge to you for any of this access. We made the decision long ago that we would remain a commercial-free resource that would not be influenced by any pressure from any outside company. There are only two ways that we are able to continue to operate this ministry and provide you with the only live 4-hour daily Christian television talk show program. The first is through your support and tax-deductible contributions to Igniting a Nation. These can be made directly through the donate button on the website or sent through the mail to Igniting a Nation, 2700 Corporate Drive, Suite 120, Birmingham, Alabama, 35242. The other way we support the program is by offering you a unique opportunity to have access to over 10 years worth of teachings on a subscription basis. The teaching archives contains all of my prior sermons, Torah studies, prophecy in the news videos, and much more for the low subscription price of $5 per month. This subscription grants you unlimited access to over 800 hours of content not available elsewhere, and is updated weekly with the most current prophecy classes. In addition to 20 hours of original TV programming each weekday, we invite you to join us live every Monday, Tuesday, and Thursday evenings for our Prophecy in the News classes. The times and locations are listed on our events page on the website www.ianbn.com. Every day, you and I are faced with the challenge of where we will go to hear the truth. We are committed to bring you the only program of its kind that covers the headlines, the heartlines, and biblical truth. We cannot do this without your support. Since we launched on January 5th, 2017, we have aired over 300 individual teachings, interviews, and commentaries not available anywhere else. We are now working side by side with almost every major Christian publishing house to bring you the most in-depth feature interviews possible. Our one-hour features address every subject that affects the believer's life. We are hearing of salvations from the Middle East, Africa, and all across the United States. Lives are being changed every day, and we have only just begun. Our mission is to become your trusted resource and grant you access to the people, tools, and information you need to grow in your relationship with the Lord. You can help us by liking us on social media and through your financial support. We know you have many choices in who you support, but we are prayerfully asking you to consider helping us keep revealing the truth, true to our calling, to cover the headlines, the heartlines, and biblical truth like no other program available. Donate today and help us bring the message to the four corners of the earth. Visit www.ianbn.com and donate, buy a book, or subscribe to our teaching archives. Without you, we do not exist. Shalom and welcome back to this edition of Revealing the Truth, where we cover the headlines, the heartlines, and biblical truth. I'm your host, the Reverend Rabbi Eric Walker, and we're talking with Glen and Ellen Schuknecht, authors of A Spiritual Heritage, Connecting Kids and Grandkids to God and Family. When we went on break, Glen and I were having a conversation about the father's role. We are now raising a generation of an entire society of fatherless children, of not unfathered, because they had to be fathered in order to be born, but the absentee father, creating a huge problem in the inner city, putting a huge drain on the federal financial social services program, and putting a huge drain on the fact that if you grow up in that inner city fatherless environment, you are some 25 times more likely to be functionally illiterate, which literacy is the number one issue within all aspects of what we would consider to be marginal society. That means 75% of every juvenile that's in the juvenile system is functionally illiterate. 80% of all welfare recipients are functionally illiterate. This, to me, is a crime. And I can speak from experience. I was illiterate until I was 8 years old because I could not master English because I was surrounded by so many foreign languages. I come from an Eastern European home. Foreign languages are verb, noun. English is noun, verb. Bob walks. It's not that way in Hebrew, Yiddish, Hungarian, Ukrainian. There are not 5 meanings to the same word. Okay, the word there. Right. Well, which there do you mean? There, T-H-E-R-E, R-E, or E-I-R, or then the expression, oh, there. Well, are you talking about where? Or are you talking about, what about, I mean, there's just so many, and it's so complicated. And it's because we teach our kids sight reading. Right? I had to learn, and sight reading was taught in the 50s when I was growing up. Okay, so you learn to sight read. I had to learn how to read phonetically. So I could have been part of that. My father only had an 8th grade education from the old country, so I could have easily just become a factory worker and would have worked, but never exceeded or excelled unless it was identified that I clearly had a learning issue, and it was because of language. So, you know, this when this big NFL debate came of all these multimillionaires refusing to stand for the national anthem, I said, first of all, before you make your protest, let's check your voting record. I'll bet you've never voted in a single election, so you're out of here. Second of all, how many of you are building literacy centers in the communities you came from? How many of you are willing to give back? I ran a pretty harsh op-ed in the Washington Times, Conservative Daily, Conservative Firing Line, WorldNet Daily, a number of places because of this. But the father's role in intact family, in a biblically based family, doesn't mean he has to be biblically the most knowledgeable. Doesn't mean that he has to be the Bible study leader. Doesn't mean he has to be the under-shepherd or co-pastor. It means he has to set the boundaries and the parameters for decency and for biblical order in his home. And if that means that you, Glen, assign authority to Ellen for this aspect of rearing the children and the grandchildren, you have not abdicated your role as head of household. You have executed your role as head of household. We seem to take on this idea that the man being the head of the household means he has to do it all. No, he's responsible for it all.
Right.
But if he does not assign out, if he does not allocate, if he does not participate, if he is not involved in this process, then it does become fully matriarchal, and it comes out of God's balance. How do you, through your program and your story and your books, A Spiritual Heritage, connecting kids and grandkids to God and family, what is the key? And there is one key to all of this that makes this possible. Have you been able to identify that key?
Wow, one key.
Well, to me, when you say one key, it immediately to me becomes that we're submissive under the Lord and to each other, and that we're working in unity and under God's direction, but in grace and unity together. We don't always know, but it has to be there.
The key is together.
Yes. Yes.
The key is that you have to say, I am not going to let time or distance. That was your grandfather in Finland.
Yes.
Now, what's interesting is when you were separated from the family, you felt separated from the family. And this is a very natural kind of lesson of how God teaches us things. The very thing that made you feel connected to your grandfather, even though he wasn't present, were his letters. Mm-hmm. And here you were placed in the exact same circumstances, but you felt disconnected. Mm-hmm. And God will use your brokenness, what you were longing to have with your own family that you had with your grandfather, but you weren't obtaining it.
Yes.
It drove you to do something, and that was apply those principles. And ultimately, you relocated. Mm-hmm. But for the family that is spread out, these are the principles for when you do gather and for when you are apart, that there are traditions. My father used to travel to the Orient in the late 50s. He traveled with a dictaphone. He would be gone for 6 to 8 weeks.
Wow.
And every couple of weeks in the mail would come a tube with a roller that slid into, it was a silicone roll that slid into a dictaphone on our end. So he had one that he dictated into and one that played back. And he would send messages from the Orient to the family via dictaphone. And we would gather around the table and we would listen to it. And he would say, this one is for Mom, so kids, you leave the room. And there's things I need to ask her to do. And then she would call and say, well, my sister Lynn, this is for you. And my father would have a message for Lynn, and this one was for Eric, and I would have a message for me. Mine was mostly disciplinary and reminding, that just because I'm gone doesn't mean your mother's not keeping good records, and that it's not cumulative, and that it will be dealt with. And then there was my little sister who was the untouchable. But he created that kind of connection even back then using the technology of the day. So it's really quite interesting what we remember. And if you think about that, today we have the ability to dictate. We have the ability to, as we get to be our age, we start talking about our last will and testament and what, who we're going to leave what to. And my message to my daughter is, basically, as long as I'm able, I will spend it until it's gone, and I have absolutely no obligation to leave you a thing. So, Dad, why are you going on that place? Because I'm spending your inheritance. Thank you, baby, for sending me on this trip. But I have begun to verbally dictate letters to my daughter and to people in my life that will be in a box, in the same box that has my last will and testament, has my wishes for all the paperwork. And these will be thoughts that I don't want to express today in life. They may be, none of course are negative. They're all with hope and with blessing and with love and with compassion and things that I want to make sure get said my way while I'm living. Okay? Not somebody saying, and this is what I heard at my father's funeral, oh, you should have heard your father talk about you. I said, I don't ever remember my father talking to me, except by a dictaphone or through punishment. So, the stories he used to tell. And so that was the only knowledge I ever had that he ever spoke of his son. When I preached his funeral, and I was asked to preach his funeral, and I got up there, people would say, who is that? And they would say, well, that was his son. Say, oh, we never knew he had a son. And it's because I left home at 15 and never returned. But to leave a spiritual heritage, and I went out to find my family, my physical heritage. Went to Hungary, went to Germany, went to Ukraine, went to all the places across the world, Israel, to find who and where my family came from because the paperwork was so disjointed. But I was able to put this together for my daughter to give her her heritage that she'll have and the legacy that she will always have as to who she belonged to. And it was, of course, always the Lord. How much time does it take for, and this is an intentional and it is a lifelong commitment. How much time do you see yourself, if you were to take a look at an allocation of time, how much time does this take you in a week?
So I want to start and just touch a little bit on your word together. I think it's a lifestyle, and so it's hard to quantify with time. Like it's for Glen and I, and when we were parents, well, we're still parents, but as grandparents, it's including each other. So there is a together view that we're presenting to our children and grandchildren our viewpoints together. We work out the differences behind the scenes. But I'm communicating with Glen what's going on. He's communicating to me. So there isn't a sense of us running in our own lanes. And to me, so when you're talking about what we do, I feel like it's ingrained in our entire day to some degree because we're thinking and communicating. And I see sometimes young couples where they don't know what their spouse is doing or what they're spending their money on or where they're going. And I feel like you have to develop a lifestyle of togetherness as husband and wife that you each know and are connected throughout the day. And out of that connection, there's a security that's passed on to your children and grandchildren because they see, I mean, they see the beauty of the unity of that marriage, which is a mystery, you know, Christ and his church and you know, how that is, but it has to be an all day long affair. And Glenn and I aren't together all day long, and we do different chores and we very much allocated our roles, but he knows what I'm doing. I know what he's doing. We know what we're thinking. We talk about the day. We talk about our goals and prayers for our kids. We talk about what we see and take a together approach.
So this has to be interwoven.
Yes.
All day long.
Do you find that if you use on a regular basis the activity in which you're engaged in to create a platform for telling a story, creating a story, or using it as an object lesson, and that becomes your style, your pattern, your go-to strategy, that eventually it becomes a habit,
Yes.
it becomes a lifestyle form, and then you're able to interweave into that. And also, and do you remember when Peter was, or do you remember when Jesus was? Well, I wonder if he was facing it the same way. Just think of what kind of tools he would have been using, what kind of boat he might have been in, and integrating all of that so that it becomes this inquisitive, probative, because that's what storytelling is supposed to be about, is that you tell them enough of the story, but then they ask, well, how big were the trees? And what color were the horses that the men rode on? And they start to ask for details because in their mind, they're creating stories that they're going to remember.
And I think even more, I'm such a believer in asking questions, me talking 5 to 10%, them talking 90%, as they talk through, well, this is what I get from what my grandpa did back then, and this is how I get that. And they're able to just talk through and almost give themselves the lecture. I don't have to lecture them. They give themselves through the story. One of the things that you mentioned was intentional. You used that word just a little bit ago. And intentional parenting, intentional grandparenting is so critical. We've got to do this on purpose. And we've got to have a plan for how we're going to reach these little guys. And it's can't be just a hit and miss. I love we have internet now and phones and texting, and as grandparents, we've got to learn how to use those.
Yes.
So that we can be part of our kids. How did your algebra test go today? You know, as grandparents, that shows that relationship.
And that you care. Glen does a really good job of asking questions and getting our kids to open up and our grandkids. But I'm going to go back and tie this back to the together again, because when our kids were growing up, we would discuss our goals together for our kids and discuss the issues and the weaknesses we were addressing. Then what we were doing throughout the day and what we do throughout the day with our grandchildren has a plan and a purpose. It's just not conversation. There's intentionality and direction assigned to it.
Do you have, long ago, way too long that I would like to admit, I had to turn in lesson plans for classes. They wanted me to have some idea of what I was going to do that day with the class. I thought it was a complete waste of time because I absolutely never, ever went off the plan. the plan was designed for them to lay off of me for a week, and that's why I always had them done and turned in on time, and they left me alone. And I would teach what it was that I thought that needed to be taught, and based on what they were reacting to. Okay, if you were my grandfather and called me and asked me how I was doing in algebra, I would answer you in a language you do not speak, and give the phone to someone else, and step out of that equation, because I was horrible. And I was a horrible student. Nobody wanted to talk and teach me what I wanted to learn. They wanted me to learn what they wanted me to learn. So in my life, I turned to my grandfather, who taught me what I wanted to learn. He walked to synagogue with me. He took me to the rabbi. He allowed me as a 4-year-old boy to sit one-on-one in a chair with him and the rabbi and ask questions and get answers that my father didn't know, my grandmother wouldn't know, my mother would not know, but my grandfather, because he still had the old country Jewish values and felt that a child's questions should be answered, especially when they were of a rabbinical nature, and they were. I had questions. Rabbi, you said God killed the Perizzites. Why did he kill them? What were they doing wrong? Why were they considered being? And I was able to ask from the age of 4.
Wow.
Okay, I'm 66. I have been asking those same questions for 62 years. And I've asked these questions of some of the greatest rabbis in the world.
Wow.
From here to Israel, to Hungary, to Ukraine, to all over the world, to be able to have these kind of dialogues, because this is my passion, is the Bible and the truth of the Bible from Genesis to Revelation. So I'm a Jewish believer in Jesus. And so to be able to have that, and so my grandfather was able to facilitate that for me. I think it's very important that parents and grandparents understand, one, how each child learns and what each child's special interest is, and find a way to incorporate that into the spiritual heritage, that if one of them likes to build with crafts, that you find the value proposition, you find the storyline which allows them to then create and build something that you can point back to. You remember when, and go back to that, and that becomes a treasure. Okay? Throughout life we shed a lot of property, a lot of things. We get rid of a lot of stuff. But some of the things we consider to be our most prized possessions are old photographs of the family, the first ashtray, the first footprint. My 28-year-old daughter just made me get rid of her umbilical cord. Okay? That was very hard for me.
Wow.
But that was in her box. My daughter's adopted, so I wanted every part of her that I could keep. Not that I had any attachment to this petrified piece of, I don't even know what it is. But when I moved, she opened the box and she said, "You must immediately, and don't just take it." She said, "I'm not taking it just to the corner, to your trash can. I am taking it to the corner so that it disappears for all time."
All time.
You mentioned the uniqueness of a child, and on the last part, extra tools to put into practice, we have a chapter titled "The Purpose in Each Child's Uniqueness."
Yes.
And I think it's such a gift how creative God is and how unique He has put together our children. And we definitely advocate parents to really apply unique strategies with their kids even, and to know their bents, because you can't even disciple or discipline very different children in the same fashion. You need to know who they are. And I think I really love that you brought that up. It's something that's very, both of us being educators for many years and then working with parents, is to help parents love the child they have and not the child they want or think they are, that they see that uniqueness and strength. I just love how God makes everybody so unique.
Amen and amen. Glen and Ellen Schuknecht, authors of A Spiritual Heritage, Connecting Kids and Grandkids to God and Family. If you want a personal relationship, an enduring relationship, and a heritage to leave behind, don't write your obituary. Don't be concerned about what they're going to say after you're gone. Live a life of a living heritage which builds on joy, connection, and a foundation of faith. Train up a child in the way they should go. But in this way of grandparents training up children, using the oldest method in the Bible, the oldest method of Judaism, is through the telling of stories and engaging the child in the story. Not the vain imagination, but in the real imagination of a child that God says, come to me, you little ones. I want you to come like children. Let us raise them up. And today, we are younger as grandparents than we used to be. We're more involved as grandparents than we used to be. In some cases, we're primary caregivers as grandparents, which is a new shift and a new dynamic. You have a rich opportunity. And look, you may have raised your kid with Dr. Spock. He had no children. And he wrote the book that people use for 30 years on how to raise children. And the man had no children. I was raised under Dr. Spock. Okay? He had no children. We now have the tools, spiritual tools of believers with a strong faith to generate a passionate and God-connected future generation. Glen and Ellen Schuknecht, thank you so much for sharing A Spiritual Heritage, Connecting Kids and Grandkids to God and Family. Thank you for being with us here on Revealing the Truth.
Thank you for the privilege of getting to talk today. It was wonderful.
Well,
Merry Christmas.
Merry Christmas, and God bless you both.
God bless you too.
We're going to take a short break, and when we come back, we'll bring you the next edition of Revealing the Truth.